Hello, my name is Marvin Oxenham, and in this video I would like to talk about a vision for character and virtue, and in particular for character and virtue education in the context of theological education. And I will be using some slides to support my talk. So the first topic we will talk about in this video is what is character and virtue education. So here we will be looking for some definitions and to try to enrich our understanding of the topic. Secondly, in what ways can character and virtue education represent a powerful renewal for theological education? And thirdly, can we root character and virtue education in theology? So as theologians, it is particularly important that any educational activities that we undertake are also well-rooted in theology and in the Bible. So let's start then with the first question, and I'll be glancing over every now and again to some notes here just to make sure that I get through all of the content that I've planned. So first of all, let me talk about the formational dimension. Now, some of you may know that although I look very much from North America, I'm actually born in Italy, so I'm a migrant of sorts from Canada to Italy, where I was born and raised in Rome. So I am Italian just as much as I am Canadian. And in Italy, as you may know, in Rome, where I was born, there used to be in the Roman Empire chariot races, and you may have seen the movie Ben-Hur with those wonderful horses that are racing around the Circus Maximus in these races. And there were typically 4 horses that would pull a biga around the Circus Maximus. And I would like to use the image of these 4 horses as 4 different aspects or 4 different outcomes, kinds of outcomes of theological education. The first being academics. So the first horse would be the horse of academics, and we know what that looks like. The second horse is the horse of ministry training and competences, therefore the skills that are necessary for those that study theology then in their ministry and work. The third horse would be spiritual formation, and we will talk a little bit more about spiritual formation and what we may mean or not mean, or not be quite sure what we mean by spiritual formation. But the fourth horse, I argue, is character and virtue education. And I believe that character and virtue education potentially are, if we can say that there's one horse that is more important than others, character and virtue are that important horse. There was, in fact, in the biga, as it ran around the Circus Maximus, the inner horse was the most important horse. It was the strongest because as the chariot hurtled around the corner at the end of the Circus Maximus, that was the horse that would anchor the other 3 and the chariot as it raced around. And I believe that character and virtue education are that anchoring horse. They are that outcome in theological education which needs to rise to a place of prominence. If not the most prominent, certainly to a place of greater prominence in what we do intentionally in theological education. Now, in terms of aspirations, many of us aspire to character education. We talk about the importance of it, but in actual practice, my experience has been that very little is being done intentionally to actually work in theological education on character education. So, if we can summarize, some of the outcomes of theological education have to do with knowing. Some of them have to do with doing. Character and virtue education have to do with being, with shaping who our graduates actually are as a result of our educational impact in their lives. So let me just mention here that when we talk about the tradition of character and virtue, this is a tradition that crosses eras, cultures, philosophies, and continents. So in particular, as one living in Italy, I've explored the classical roots extending into European philosophy, so the Greek and the Roman philosophy, the educational tradition, in particular the tradition that runs from Aristotle through to virtue ethics and MacIntyre as a contemporary author. But the tradition of character and virtue is also very strong and prevalent in other religions, in other cultures, and in other traditions. So, for example, in Islam, there are universal virtues that are meant to shape our life as human beings. And these are said to be called the guiding virtues. And the Prophet Muhammad himself said that he had been sent to fulfill the virtue which goes with nobility of character. Confucianism as well is rich with reference to character and virtue. Central to Confucius's teaching is the idea of Ren as perfect virtues, and the virtues that are dealt with in the Anaklets include the 5 ways of reverence, tolerance, trustworthiness, quickness, and generosity, just to mention some of them. Buddhism also claims that there's something about human nature that has an innate disposition to virtues, the virtues like compassion. But then, of course, there are poisons in human nature that need to be overcome. And so there are 4 mandatory virtues in Buddhism: the virtue of compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic, joy, and equanimity in community. And so we can go on. I also took a look at African traditions. The Ubuntu tradition focuses on humanness and the need to realize the higher parts of human nature, which happens mainly, again, through the cultivation of social virtues within a community. And these virtues include, again, generosity, hospitality, friendliness, caring, and compassion. And in the Indian epics, such as the Ramayana or the Panchatra stories and the Bhagavad Gita, here as well, there are virtues listed and dealt with, like fearlessness, purity of heart, knowledge, devotion, and so on. And we could go on to talk about Sumerian literature and other cultural traditions as well. But this is just to give you a taste, to say that when we are looking at character and virtue, this is a global tradition. This is something that is part of human nature. And one could also argue of common grace and the way that we are actually made in the image of God. We are made to cultivate and to pursue virtue. There's also a very rich tradition in church history. So as we look at our own Christian church, in church history, there's a very rich tradition in character and virtue. There is a sort of golden thread that if some of you are church historians, you can pick up on virtue in church history. It builds, of course, on the classical tradition, but then it moves continually and constantly through authors like Clement of Alexandria, who spoke of the paideia of God, to Origen, the desert fathers and mothers, Cassian, who had the tree of virtues and the tree of vices, Ambrose, Augustine, the monastic movement, Abelard, and of course Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, in whose Summa Theologica, virtue is actually one of the greatest themes of one of the greatest works, one could argue, in medieval theology. Concerning theological education, even as far back as the 4th century, Chrysostom, in his book on the priesthood, which was concerned with training priests for the ministry, he was concerned. Why do priests not turn out well? And he actually argued that the main problem was that attention was not being given to their character. And so the cultivation of virtuous life was so important for those in church ministry. And Ambrose of Milan also famously argued that it was useless to look for a spring in the mud. And so the church must have leaders that have purity in their own character. So we can move on through church history. Coming to our own times, there are many contemporary examples of the revival of character and virtue education. We can see these in school movements, in primary and secondary schools across the world are starting to look again at how to educate character. Trends are beginning in higher education as well to look at character and how that can be cultivated. Character and virtue are also becoming popular today in professions, the paradigms of law, health, media, business, professional workers, high finance, corporate management. Again, there's a growing body of research that is looking back to the issues of character and virtue and how they impact these particular professions. So I could go on, and I have gone on in my book to argue more and give you more examples of this. But this is enough just to say that when we are looking at character and virtue tradition, this is a very, very broad tradition that has roots historically, culturally, and even across different segments of society. So let's move on to the next slide, where we actually try to define the words that we are using in character and virtue education. So here I have C, V, and E, and the first word, C, is character, V is virtue, and E is education. So let me just unpack briefly what these have to do with the definition that we have at hand. So first of all, character. It is important that we're talking about character. When we talk about virtue, it is not just a bucket list of rules that we are telling people to obey. That is legalism. Aristotle talked about one sparrow does not make spring. And so one good action or obeying one rule does not change your character. So what we are looking here is a permanent shaping of character through stable dispositional clusters of praiseworthy functionings in different areas of our lives. So this is the deep root of who we are, not just an addition of things that we need to do. So we are talking about changing our character, our dispositions, our emotions, the way that we think, the way that we act naturally comes through our character. The second word is virtue. So there's a lot of confusion over the word character. Sometimes people think about character in terms of personality, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about being introvert or extrovert. We're talking about being courageous or cowardly. And clearly there's a moral dimension to virtue. So we're latching on to that specific tradition of the virtues, which, as we've seen, cuts across cultures. It cuts across different religions and philosophies. So we're actually talking about character and virtue and putting the two together. And then, of course, education. And I've chosen the word education rather than formation. Now, we could also use the formation. There's nothing wrong with formation, which gives the idea of actually shaping someone, so it's a very good word. But formation sometimes is used in a more religious context. And so I would argue that we should maybe redeem the broader word education, which actually in its original meanings and in many cultures and educational traditions had to do with shaping the human being into the fullness. So with all the different dimensions we've mentioned of academic skills and competences, but also the character of the person. So, and of course, this is not just instruction. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the practices of character and virtue education. So education intended in the broadest possible sense of shaping human beings. And one of the advantages of using the word education instead of formation is that it opens to us all of that literature that is not only religious, but that is secular as well, that talks so much about character and virtue education. So these are three key words: character and virtue education. Now, let me just say something here about another word that is precious to us as theological educators, which is spiritual formation. So why do we talk about character and virtue education and not simply about spiritual formation? I argue that actually, although there is significant overlap between character and virtue education and spiritual formation, it is useful to think of them separately, especially from an educational point of view. My impression is that many schools, even when they talk about spiritual formation, they've not worked this out in detail, and that issues like our anthropological vision of human being, what does it mean to be human? How are we made? What maturity looks like? What does it mean to be spiritual? And what educational strategies can we help people enact to become more spiritual? Some of these are largely unaddressed. So even when we talk about spiritual formation, sometimes we're very vague. We more or less, we talk about prayer, we talk about chapel, we talk about maybe spiritual disciplines. But again, the actual formation of spirituality is not perhaps as clear sometimes as it might be. So then it becomes even vaguer if we try to make a distinction between character and virtue education and spiritual formation, which sometimes are used as synonyms. And again, there is legitimate overlap. So, for example, the fruit of the Spirit, one would say, well, that is spiritual formation. But if you look at the fruit of the Spirit that are listed in Galatians, those are actually virtues. It is a list of virtues that are the fruit of the Spirit. So there is, as you can see, there's overlap, spiritual formation, but it also has to do with the character and with virtues. So educationally, I would simply suggest that spiritual formation and character and virtue education are different and require different educational strategies. In 1987, there was a seminar held by the Association of Theological Schools in the States with 23 different scholars. And Dr. Kelsey actually summarized with the graph that I've reproduced here a possible distinction about how to talk about spiritual formation and where character education fits in. So the argument here is that spiritual formation can be thought of in Trinitarian terms, with a theocentric, more mystical dimension of spiritual formation, which typically have to do with cultivating our relationship with God. So there's the spiritual practices of discernment, prayer, and so forth. Then there is a spirit-centered spiritual formation, which has to do with the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, and so more of perhaps the charismatic dimensions, the fruit of the Spirit, the Spirit-filled walk, Spirit-centered activities. But then there's a third dimension to spiritual formation, which is Christ-centered. So God-centered, Spirit-centered, Christ-centered. And this has more to do with our walk as disciples. So here, this has to do with following Jesus and with taking up our cross and with loving our neighbor and so forth. And it is here in this Christ-centered dimension of spiritual formation that there's a significant overlap with character education, which actually has to do with making us into the kind of people that are followers of Jesus in our character. So that is, and much more can be said about this, and you may want to have a discussion about this if you have small groups following this video, because this is a very interesting topic. And again, there is overlap, but it is educationally helpful, I argue, to think about character education and spiritual formation differently. So let me move on now, and we're about halfway through. I hope you won't get tired of watching this video. Maybe you're taking notes. That will help you keep your attention and keep your focus. But here are 3 key words to help us focus even further on what we mean by character and virtue education. The first word is purpose. And so this is, if you want to use the complicated term, this is a teleological thought about character and virtue. And here the suggestion is that the purpose of human life is to be agents of goodness. So the question is, what is the purpose of human life? So therefore, what constitutes being a good person, a good woman, a good man in the fullest sense of the term? Because once we've solved that problem, we find the meaning for all human action. So character and virtue education, they're founded on the assumption that the purpose of human life that God has created us to be is to be agents of goodness and agents of virtue. And again, much more could be said about that, but I will just leave it there for now. The second key word is, which is connected to the first, is the word happiness. And one could also say the word flourishing. When the telos of human life is fulfilled, when the purpose of human life is fulfilled, that is when we achieve deep happiness. That is when we achieve human flourishing. So just as an acorn grows to be an oak tree, so human beings are meant to flourish by means of virtue. So the purpose of human life is to be agents of goodness, and happiness and flourishing is found as we become virtuous. So you can see there's some very deep issues at stake here that have to do not only with the practices of character and virtue, but with how they're connected with who we are as human beings and how God has created us. And the third word, of course, is actually virtue. What does virtue mean? And in the discussion at the end of this session, I will encourage you to actually go into your own language, if it is not English, and look up the word virtue. What word is used in your own language for virtue, and what does it convey? The virtues are those which lead to human flourishing, and therefore the virtues are what contribute to meeting man's highest purpose. Just as a knife finds its purpose in having a sharp edge to cut bread, so human nature is fulfilled in developing virtue. Human happiness, some have said, is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So nothing is more important than developing virtuous character. Now, a complex definition of virtue, you can look up if you want on the internet, if you have access to internet, definitions even in your own language of virtues. Here's one. Virtues are stable dispositional clusters concerned with praiseworthy functioning in a number of significant and distinctive spheres of human life. Now, that's a mouthful. And you may want to go back and read it again, maybe listen to that part of the video again. I've also unpacked that in a chapter in my book, so you can read it and think it through with greater care. But what you see here in this wheel, so this I've sort of zoomed in on that last image. There are different. Actually, there's the definition. I forgot. So there's the definition I just read. So you can copy it now as you talk. Virtues are stable dispositional clusters concerned with praiseworthy functioning in a number of significant and distinctive spheres of human life. Part of the problem that we have in many cultures across the world is that we have lost virtue literacy. We no longer really know what the words mean. And so part of the teaching and training that we can offer to our students and to ourselves is actually to understand better, to increase our own virtue literature. So here you see, this is an image that I've designed. It just shows you, and I'll look over here, I can see it a little bit bigger. It shows you different kinds of virtues. They're clusters. There's the cardinal virtues, for example, of prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. There are, of course, the Christian virtues, also called the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. There are social virtues like friendliness, honesty, civility, diligence, loyalty, and so forth and so on. Now there's the discussion that is taking place, a very interesting discussion on whether there are universal virtues across cultures and across eras. And I think a case can be made that there are some virtues which are universal for all people in all times and all cultures. But there are also virtues that are specific to particular cultures or particular historical times or even to particular individuals. So there is no prescriptive list of virtues. These are examples that are given. And actually part of the discussion that you'll be having at the end of this session is to think about your own culture, your own context. What are important virtues in your own culture and your own context? So this is just to give you an idea. The word virtue, so much can be said. And on the shelves behind me, I have book after book after book that talk and describe about what the virtues are. So as you can tell, it is a fascinating topic in my own personal research. So let us move on now to the second question. This one won't be quite as long as the first question. In what ways can character and virtue represent a renewal in theological education? Well, first of all, as I've mentioned, it connects theological education to a broader renaissance. If you go on Google in English, there's over 1 billion hits on the words character and virtue. After a 16th century decline, and I've talked about this elsewhere, why there was a decline, there is now a renewed discourse around character and virtue, both in theory and in the practices of education. So what we are doing in theological education, we are connecting theological education to this broader Renaissance is a very important dimension of what we do. Secondly, it is important that we correct some of the imbalances in theological education. Now, in part, a lot of theological education across the world has sort of followed the project of the Enlightenment, which was a rationalistic project, where knowledge was very important, understanding was very important, critical thinking was very important. So the rise of academics. And many theological schools have done fantastic work in giving that academic depth to theology and theological education. But there may be an imbalance where we have followed that particular project, and now we need to look at other of the outcomes of theological education alongside the development of academic culture. So Miroslav Volf, in one of his latest books, For the Life of the World, he actually asks, what does theology have to offer? And he actually suggests there are questions that we can answer with theology that have to do with the flourishing of human life. And so therefore, he also connects on to virtue discourse. Thirdly, theological education is renewed through character and virtue education because it reaffirms the place of theology in society. As we educate our students and our graduates in character and in virtue, we are not just contributing to the church and to its mission, although we will address that in a moment, but we are actually enriching our society. We are contributing to social welfare. We are helping democracies, if we live in a democracy, be healthier. We are creating better women and better men and better citizens. And I've written a brief chapter on the social apologetic of virtue, together with a chapter on the political impact that theological education can have in shaping citizens that are worthy and of democracy and that are virtuous. So what I argue here is that we need to enlarge our Missio Dei, taking seriously, for example, even the Cape Town commitment of the integral mission of the church, not just about proclaiming the gospel, but about discerning its truths as they impact the world in which we live. So let me just read a section here from my book. The formation of women and men of character and virtue is one of the greatest gifts that the church can give society. We are not just training pastors and church leaders to build the church. We are contributing to the formation of citizens that will bless the world. This vision shifts our thinking considerably. It complements a posture of knowledge and proclamation with an attitude of virtue and presence. It brings together the shouting of the gospel from the mountaintop with the shining of the gospel in the valleys of the real world. It means not only leading earthly individuals to heaven, but it means bringing heavenly goodness to earth. In educational terms, this vision explodes into our learning outcomes and revitalizes the dimension of being alongside knowing and doing, and enriches our theological curricula beyond conversionism, activism, biblicism, and crucicentrism, to embrace outcomes that will bless society and represent maybe even a new apologetic for the Christian faith. So, all that to say that through character and virtue, we are reaffirming the place of theology and in culture and society. And finally, we can renew theological education with a new emphasis on character and virtue because this responds to a felt need of the church. And I think we are safe here to reflect on the mismatch in priorities and leadership training between what churches need and what the academy provides. We've heard time and time again church leaders that lament that graduates from theological schools, they seem to be misfits, and they don't always offer what is really needed in the church. Now, this may be, again, because theological education has placed a premium on academic engagement, whereas the churches may have higher expectations on practical training, but also on issues of character. I don't know how many of you have been involved in ministry failures or in church splits, which are terrible. But often, if you think of them, they have to do with character. They have to do with leaders that are proud, that are jealous, that are greedy, that don't have self-control, that are angry, and so these are issues of character. The issue is rarely theological, academic theological ability or competences. It almost always has to do with character. So, and if we look at the New Testament, look at the leadership qualifications in the New Testament, the books of Timothy and Titus. They are all about virtues. Go reread them, perhaps after this particular talk. And Paul lists what it means to be a leader, and he lists virtues. Very little about competences, and maybe only one verse on the ability to teach. So there's something to do, obviously, with biblical knowledge and understanding, but such an emphasis on character and virtue. Renewing theological education. And let me conclude here with just a very brief summary of how we might think of rooting character and virtue education in theology. Now, this is a very important question. We may not even be sure what the question means. We need to think about our methodologies in working out a theology of character and virtue education. And that is a topic for a different discussion. There is actually a small course that I've developed that may help address that particular question. But here are just some examples of how we can theologize on character and virtue. Some of the sources, some of the ways that we might go about looking at theology in the Bible to build a theology of character and virtue. So just for example, biblical theology. We can look at virtue in character, in creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Old Testament heroes of virtue. So much of the Old Testament are narratives. They're stories about heroes of virtue. You know, David or Abraham or Isaac or those that we've actually told the Sunday school stories about. They're heroes of virtues. Of course, there's also heroes of vice. There's villains. That when we read the stories, we don't want to be like that. We want to be virtuous. Now, and that is actually, by the way, a very powerful educational tool, telling the stories of the heroes of virtue. And the Old Testament is rich with that. And so is the New Testament, of course. We can read the New Testament looking for heroes of virtue, obviously Jesus, but also the apostles, Paul, some of the minor figures, so many virtues that are actually shown to us through real life stories of the people that we have in the Old and New Testament. We can look at Old Testament books. There are entire books in the Old Testament that whose principal focus is actually on character and virtue. Books like Proverbs, which are saturated with character and virtue. But also in the New Testament, we find ethical lists. And this is actually one of the devices that was used in classical antiquity in a lot of writing about character and virtue, was to actually have lists of virtues and vices. And the New Testament, we have many. Paul uses this device many times to list the fruit of the Spirit, or the deeds of the flesh, or the deeds of the Spirit. And he lists, there's probably a dozen or so of these ethical lists in the New Testament which deal with virtues. New Testament books as well. The book of James, which would be the counterpart to Proverbs in the Old Testament, is a book about virtue. Read about it again. There are some key texts about virtues. The Beatitudes. Read the Beatitudes, which is very much, Jesus' longest sermon was pretty much about virtues. But also 2 Peter 1, about adding to your faith virtue as the most important thing we can do in our Christian life. Theologically, we can think about theological topics like the recapitulation theory of the atonement, which is actually a theory of the atonement that states very briefly that the atonement is not only there to bring us to heaven and to forgive our sins, but it also is to change us as people and to make us again, to recapitulate, come back to that image of God, which again has very much to do with the shaping of our character and our virtues. And we can look to church history and dogmatics, and we've mentioned some of this before. We can look to some contemporary theologians. I've mentioned Miroslav Volf, but also Stanley Hauerwas. There's also so-called accidental theologians, which would not be necessarily Christian theologians, but philosophers like some of those that I've mentioned, Alistair MacIntyre being perhaps one of the most well-known, who's written about virtue, or ancient writers like Aristotle or Confucius or so forth, that in common grace have written some very good, some very important things about character and virtue. So we are done with this first video. I was going to say with this first virtue. You've been very virtuous in with the virtue of attentiveness in following this long and detailed video. Here are now some engagement questions that you can take some time to deal with either on your own or in small groups. The first question is, of the four horses of theological education that we saw at the beginning, which prevails in your context and why? Is it academics? Is it skills and competences? Is it spiritual formation? Is it character education? Which of those prevails in your theological school and why? Second question, how might your colleagues react to the proposal of making character education the primary outcome of theological education? So coming back to the image of the horse, that inner horse becomes the most important, or certainly one of the most important. How would your colleagues react in your school at that particular proposal? Third, what is the word for virtue in your own language? Look it up. Maybe take some time and go on the internet, find some synonyms. What are also, together with this question, some important virtues in your culture? What is talked about in the news? What is happening in schools? What is society sort of asking more of? Is it more courage? Is it more justice? Is it more peace? Is it more harmony? Is it more empathy? What are the virtues that are particularly sensitive in your culture? And together with that, question number 4, what virtues are important and missing in the life of the church in your context? If there was a gift that theological education could give to the church in terms of a new generation of leaders shaped in character and virtue, what virtues in particular would be needed and desired in the church? And finally, just to connect with this last conversation, what theological, biblical grounding do you see for character and virtue education, beyond some of the examples that were given in the previous slide, from your own studies, from your own background, from your own theological engagement? What are some areas that you see that could give theological or biblical grounding to character and virtue education? So those are 5 questions. Clearly, you can go beyond those. You can engage with other of the questions. You may want to talk more about the difference between spiritual formation and character formation, or perhaps other things that have emerged from this video that you would like to discuss. So thank you again for watching this particular video on a vision of character and virtue.